Power, ambition, and envy are the domains of nobility. Although it can be nice to dream of a more righteous sense of chivalry, it's an undeniable truth that every lord seeks power, and especially the power of other lords. To become the only source of envy in the world is the ultimate goal of a noble line. To escape envy, for the prospect of inspiring it in all, is everything. It's certainly a cynical view on hereditary lineages, but it also sure explains a lot about the world. One such subject of this cynical view on lineage is the Duchess of Buchalerion, Helene Antiochates, who rules from the city of Heraclea. She's a local power holder in the Eastern Roman Empire, and she's garnered a reputation as a beautiful but scary woman of power. More than that though, she's someone that some in the empire have connected to Amestris, the ancient tyrant despot of Heraclea, who was drowned by her children. For Helene, it's an honor to be connected to a powerful woman, but for the rest of the realm, it's something of a curse upon her. Through the combined power of her beauty and her imposing reputation, Helene has been able to arrange for special council privileges with the Basileus, and through her new seat on the council as a spymaster, she began to weave her web of terror over the Eastern Roman Empire. This is the story of the true inheritor of the legacy of Amestris, and it was made possible using the Achaemenid Legends mod on the Steam Workshop. Disclaimer, I made this mod, and this video acts as a deeper look into the mod's content as well as being a GIGACHAD story. Let's dive into Helene's story and see how it unwinds. The primary resource of a Shadow Queen is neither money nor power, but leverage. It's paramount that whoever sits in Constantinople be well loved by the realm, but unbeknownst to them, in Helene's pocket. It was a fine line between chaos and order, with the need for a stable emperor at times even outweighing the need for a puppet emperor. The Roman Empire was not known for its stability, and rectifying that would be Helene's first goal. This was something which was not helped much by the presence of Turkish invaders from Persia. This was something over which Helene really had no control though, so she'd have to grit and bear it. Instead, she set her eyes on the young, unmarried sons of the Basileus, now an old man. Prince Andronicos, although younger than Helene, would make for a suitable prince, and Helene's beauty made her on the receiving end of constant betrothals and marriages, all of which she rejected. She was fit for someone born in the purple, in her words. By leveraging a favor in the form of saving the emperor's life from some conveniently placed bandits, Helene was able to arrange that marriage she had been hoping for. A woman being betrothed to a younger man was a bit out of the ordinary, but an exception could be made for the nobility. Where the relationship got strange was when, after leveraging another hook, Helene took the young Andronicos under her wing as a ward. To be raising your own future husband was certainly out of the ordinary and quite frankly, an embarrassment to the Basileus, but it was important that Helene implant into her fiancé the importance of his place as both the son of a Basileus and the wife of the most beautiful duchess to ever grace the land. He arrived in Heraclea and was pampered like a prince deserving of his station. He became a trusting kid on account of that, and he was educated to be a great commander. In the coming future, he may need some talent as a warrior to keep the throne. Helene had a whole conspiracy ready to replace the new Basileus, Michael the Stumbler, who was lazy, greedy, and cowardly. He was no worthy emperor, but Andronicos would be. Helene started a faction to put Andronicos on the throne, wormed her way onto the Council of Spymaster, and then began her plot to kidnap the emperor. Just before abducting him, Helene sent the demand to put Andronicos on the throne, and the moment the demands arrived, he was already in prison. Andronicos, as his first brother, naturally signed the demand in his stead, submitting to the demands of a faction to put himself on the throne, and suddenly, the new Basileus Andronicos began his reign. Helene was already pregnant and ready to give birth to a born-in-the-purple child. She gave birth to Adrian, and although a son would be preferable, she nonetheless was guaranteed at least one child that had rights to the throne. Before long, she was pregnant again and gave birth to twins, Christophoros and Eugenia, and afterwards Helene and Andronicos became soulmates. Naturally, Andronicos owed his station in life to her, and she certainly did make that clear to him. Thanks to his brother Michael's utter incompetence, Andronicos actually had a strong rule over the empire. Not for any particular competence on his part, but rather for his comparatively superior abilities. This isn't to say he wasn't completely incompetent. He had grown into the throne rather nicely. That only made it more tragic when he died of liver poisoning from his rampant alcoholism at the age of 23. What it was that drove him to drinking was believed to be a few too many long nights of partying and celebrating his 5 children. This was not optimal for Helene, but it opened up a new opportunity. Her son, Christophoros, was now the Basileus, despite being just 3 years old. The regent was to be Helene, since she is the empress mother. Well now, that's something. Immediately, she raised the crown authority on her son's behalf, hoping to gain the opportunity to use her powers as regent for all sorts of things. She had no reason to take the throne, as her son having it was just as good, if not in some ways better. Helene got remarried to a skilled German man simply for his administrative abilities. She no longer cared to have children, albeit more could always be nice to have. She had 5 children born of an emperor, one of whom is an emperor. The purpose of this German man was to help Helene embezzle money undetected from the Byzantine treasury. She was able to steal 350 gold from the treasury while the infant Basilius was completely unaware. She rationalized it as being her family's money anyway, so she's just taking from the family trove. Nothing illegal about that. All was well until an outbreak of holy fire came to haunt the Black Sea coast. First claiming the life of Chrysanthos, the only child Helene had with her new German husband. Next was Eugenia, the emperor's twin sister. Soon, Helene herself caught the holy fire, and not wanting to die, she instructed her physician to do everything he could to cure her. Through the surgery she endured, she was left disfigured, and suddenly, the most beautiful duchess of the Byzantine Empire was left without a face. What was ironic was that with this loss of her face, Helene's true face became a little clearer. She was a tyrant, stealing money from the throne, abducting emperors, and educating her husband. At this time, her brother-in-law, Duke Methodios, is waging war to put Michael of Thrace back on the throne after it was taken from him. Although Helene is not involved in the war, she can, nonetheless, kidnap the rebellious duke and then conveniently join the war. She embezzled more money from the throne to pay off collaborators and then began the plot. She was being totally loyal to the Basilius, if only because it was in her interest, but it certainly was becoming part of her to be a loyal civil servant. In June of 1087, Helene kidnapped Methodios, seemingly for no reason. But after he was in her dungeon, she joined her Basilius war as an ally, and in so doing, ended the war for her son. His claim would be much stronger now that he had defeated a rebellion like that. He still had a few other wars to deal with, but none of them were for claimants like this last one. Some Turks were invading Crimea, which is inconsequential. The Croatians were vying for control over some of the westernmost Balkans, again inconsequential. And some peasants were rebelling, but they would be easy enough to put down. When Christophoros turned 13, the realm had finally come to peace, and although he was weak and in debt, he had fended off every claimant and only lost wars which were not important. His claim was strong, and his mother was watching over him, keeping him safe from the shadows. When the boy was 15, he did catch his mother stealing funds from the treasury, and he wasn't quite sure what to make of it at first. The royal coffers were completely empty, and yet his own mother had been the one draining them. Helene and her metal mask made it clear that this transfer of funds was for his own best interest, and demanded a pardon on the spot, in private, away from anyone that might find it shameful. The boy, of course, acquiesced to his mother's demand. Christophoros came of age, and he was an extremely talented scholar of a temperate demeanor with a strong sense of justice. He had grown into a nearly perfect Basilius, and Helene was confident that even without her interference, he would hold the throne on his own merits. From here, time passed without much going on. The Basilius went to war in Croatia, and Helene helped her son with the war, but in truth, he didn't need her anymore. He had outgrown her. This was both good and bad. Helene was still regent, and she clung to her power closely, trying to keep herself relevant. She was proud of her son, but upset that he no longer needed her. In a rage, she imprisoned several random courtiers in her realm, and underneath her mask, some say that her beauty had twisted away, not from the consequences of her surgery, the blackening of her soul. A legend, which connected her to Amestris, the old tyrant of Heraclea, began. After all, Helene had been something of a scholar of Achaemenid history in her free time, if only because of her capital being in the home of the lesser-known Achaemenid cousin, Amestris. She wasn't exactly a famous figure, but nonetheless, well-read Greeks would be aware of her. After a plague spread throughout the coast once again, Helene came down with consumption, and although the Reaper would take his sweet time claiming her soul, Helene did pass away about a year later. By this point, her reputation preceded her, but with her death, the family's fate was in the hands of the popular Basilius Christophoros. The station of the Byzantine Empire is, in some ways, that of a rump state, tracing its lineage all the way back to the Hellenic Empire under Alexander the Great. The thread of Greek culture had carried through the eastern half of the Roman Empire since those days. It goes to show the immense grandeur of the Roman Empire, that its rump would be as powerful as the Byzantine Empire, and yet it stood in shame, unable to reclaim its lineage. Every successive Byzantine emperor lived in the shadow of his glorious lineage, but Christophoros had an opportunity to look past that lineage. His mother began their connection to Amestris of the Achaemenids, but there were certainly far more important figures than just the tyrant of Heraclea after whom to earn a lineage. For now though, the legend still had much spreading to be done, and so Christophoros adopted it, emphasizing more the connection to the Achaemenid line than the connection to a tyrannical woman. The scholarly Basilius had, of his own volition, completed a legend before about his connection to a Roman lineage, and thanks to that he had claims across several of the old territories of Rome. Putting aside his mother's Achaemenid dreams, he put his mind to the reconquest of Rome. When I say Rome, I don't mean the city. I mean the empire, of course, and so Christophoros went after Croatia. In the beginning of his reign, the Croats had attempted to invade parts of the Western Balkans and had succeeded. But after punishing them later in his reign, the Basileus has now subjugated them, removing the buffer states between him and the pretender Holy Roman Empire. His work to reassert Roman authority in the Balkans was spreading his fame and his legend far and wide, and before long, the tyrant of Heraclius' descendant, Christophoros, had a mythical legend on his hands. Rather than complete the story, though, he chose to hold on to it for now. His next target was the Eternal City of Rome, which was under occupation by the Pope. In some ways, the recent success of his campaign in Croatia was getting to his head, though, and Christophoros attempted to attack a very rich target. The Pope wasn't necessarily a powerful enemy, but he had the income of the churches of the entire Catholic world. The Basileus did occupy Rome and sack it, but after some time, the mercenaries of Rome added up to enough power to remove the Greek army from the city. A truce was signed with the agreement that the Greek army would exit the area safely, and in return, Rome would be returned to the Pope. While certainly not an amicable agreement, it was one that brought a temporary peace. Christophoros can always come back for the city another time. After the birth of a son to replace the one he lost to tuberculosis, Christophoros ended the legend of the drowned tyrant of Heraclea, turning the cursed bloodline into a boon. For this, he would gain an iron grip on the empire. His eyes saw all, and both he and his children became overseers by reputation, even if it wasn't necessarily the case that they had earned such a reputation themselves. His son, Nikolaos, was the heir to a great lineage, but he did suffer from hemophilia, which might make it difficult to see him as a powerful ruler later in the future. For now, he's just a small child. His time will come. With his connection to the ancient Persians secured, Christophoros dove into the Greek archives on the old Persians looking for other figures to connect himself to. He read about Zoroaster, Darius, Cyrus, and he even read about the great immortal armies of the Achaemenids, all of whom he found great wisdom in. The Achaemenids broke the traditions of the empires they conquered. The Babylonians, Assyrians, and Akkadians of the old days were, by today's standards, genocidal maniacs, but the Achaemenids earned the loyalty of their subjects through tolerance. They revolutionized empire building, and although the lessons of the past couldn't be just copied into today, the idea of a revolutionary new direction would be wise. For now, though, these were just thoughts for Christophoros. He focused on his conquest of Sicily, which was ruled by foreign Normans. The return of Sicily to the empire was a huge step in putting the Romans back on the map. From here, building up the royal domain became his priority because the coming military campaigns for Rome and the other old territories would likely incur quite the costs. The Roman Empire was rich in both its revenues and its expenses. With Sicily taken, there was a land border between the supposed papal states and the proper Roman Empire. A land border, without any buffer states in between, escalated tensions to the point of yet another war, with Christophoros attempting to claim Romagna. This time, without the hassle of a naval landing, the Roman armies were much better prepared to take on the papal mercenaries. While the Romans sieged Terracina, the papal troops went to Abruzzi for a classic siege race. The problem is that Terracina was one of 4 fortresses in Latium, while the fortresses in the remote mountains of Sicily were of little to no importance. After Terracina fell, the armies crossed the mountains and engaged the mercenaries in Lanciano, with an outcome that I think we were all expecting. The Aurelian walls held up long enough that the Pope could relieve Terracina, but it only prolonged his needless fight to hold on to the Eternal City. The Romans were back in their true home, albeit the city loomed in Constantinople's shadow all the same. In the east, the Turks had fallen apart for their own internal problems some years ago, but in their wake were many small beyliks looking for safety. The Bey of Vaspurakan was an easily manipulated child who, after receiving some of the finest Roman toys and wares, swore his nation into fealty under the empire. The Armenians, in what remained of the Armenian kingdom, were less amenable. Citing his claim to old Roman provinces, Christophoros claimed Armenia for himself, while praying that his son should survive the typhus ravaging his body. The poor man did not. This left Christophoros struck with a permanent loss of appetite, which he'd later come to regret. At 60 years of age, he needed to be well fed to keep his health, but despite all his successes in reviving the empire, there's something to be said for the sadness of dead children. Either way, the military exploits of this great Roman emperor have been refocused through 2 important lenses. Firstly, his mother confirmed her and her lineage's connection to an Achaemenid, a mistress. Secondly, he himself had been studying Achaemenid works inspired by his mother, and after beginning to understand the importance of his legacy, he started a chronicle about his personal connection to the Achaemenid line through Darius the Great. It's not necessarily about being his descendant by blood, but more so about emulating his spirit. Obviously, being a Persian figure, Darius is something of an enemy to the Greeks, but that history is so ancient that it's really held no sway over the modern sensibilities of the Greeks. Instead, they saw a great conqueror claimed to be related to another great conqueror. Looking at his wrinkled hands, Christophoros was quite certain he would not live to see the chronicle he began completed, but he knew he was laying the foundation for his children, at least living ones. The legend quickly reached mythical proportions, as the emperor's reign had already shaken the world with its conquests. If anything, the story was less mythical than the very actions that inspired it. Nonetheless, jealous kings would always resist their fate as subjects to the Roman emperor, and so the Georgians of the Caucasus resisted annexation, only to be defeated. The cowardly Kartvelian king had moved his capital north to the lands of Alania in the hopes that it might be spared during the war, but of course Christophoros did find the relocated capital. Rather unexpectedly, the Basilius felt a new surge of youth in himself. He was wrinkly, but his body was strong and ready for further exploits. Rather than delay the completion of the Darius Chronicle, he chose to seize its glory for himself. He would go down in history as an emperor that never put the sword down. There was no retirement, only victory. With his claim to Persia secure, Christophoros had the right to engage in a full-scale invasion of the former Persian Empire. The collapsed Seljuk Empire left the entire region in shambles and a void of leadership. While each of these campaigns were composed of several wars against minor lords in their respective regions, it would be easiest to consider each region as one military campaign. Jazira, being the nearest region of the Old Persian Empire, was first to fall, and acted as the path into Mesopotamia and the Zagros Mountains. It was curious how all these lords refused to submit because, if they had, they may have been allowed to keep their titles. It was likely because each of them believed themselves to be some kind of vanquisher of the Seljuk Empire, and in so being, had thought themselves to be greater than them. The path into Persia was protected by two lords, Kemal Saftikinolu of Khuzestan, a local Seljuk lord, and Zia the city builder of Hamadan, a Dalamite warlord. Seeing a man known for building something in a land ravaged by wars was rare indeed, so Christophoros, of course, removed him from power and filled his cities with new administrators who would take those foundations and turn them into something much greater. The two gatekeepers of Persia were defeated in simultaneous wars, with Khuzestan falling first on account of its flatter terrain, and Hamadan taking a bit longer. Afterwards, Shirvan and Gurgan fell, giving Christophoros a beautiful view of the Caspian Sea. These campaigns continued deep into the plateaus of the Zagros valleys, with important cities like Isfahan, Hamadan, and Shiraz falling. The Persian campaign was going well, as the Basilius entered his mid-70s, but his health was taking a turn for the worst. After Yazd surrendered, Christophoros looked dead in the eyes. He had indeed traded his retirement for more victories, and shortly after entering the city, he collapsed, eyes in the back of his head, and without a pulse. He died suddenly, leaving his throne to his daughter, Athanasia, and she immediately stopped the campaign in the east to focus in on securing her throne. She's already in her 40s with just one surviving daughter and no husband. To say she's got a tough act to follow wouldn't just be an understatement, it'd be a lie. She had an impossible act to follow. She's not nearly the emperor her father was, but she can only hope to maintain the conquests of the emperor from Roma to Susa. Although Athanasia was the new Basilissa, she was not particularly worthy of it. In his focus on Persia, her father Christophoros had neglected to properly groom an heir, and in so doing left a drunk, stuttering, paranoid corpse on legs to rule. Athanasia ruled for less than a year before drinking herself to death under the pressure of her new life as empress, and so another coronation, this time for Rodanti, began. Rodanti was on the other end of the aisle when it came to difficulties ruling. She was not in her 40s, but rather in her 10s. I should say she was exactly 10 years old. She inherited a stutter from her mother, but she did seem promising. From a young age, Rodanti had a strong sense of right and wrong and a curious nature. She was well read, likely thanks to the many court tutors that her grandfather and mother kept around her. That being said, she was alone in this world. Her aunt, Theodosia, who was also a drunk, operated as a regent on her behalf. Right off the bat, Rodanti's vassals demanded lower crown authority, which she simply submitted to, understanding that she could not possibly assert authority how her grandfather had, and then the locals of Persia rose up in an organized rebellion against their new recent conquerors. The leader of that rebellion was quickly captured, but afterwards another rebellion came up, this time more of a unified Islamic rebellion instead of just Persian separatists. Rising tension in the east pulled the rope of power one direction, while out west, the nobles of the empire saw the opportunity to equally pull for themselves. They had gotten their liberty, but in truth, the era of the Antiochus family was surely coming to an end in this land. The vassals rose up to support a pretender, Markarios of Philippopolis, who was a descendant of the same emperor that Helene had kidnapped and dethroned about 90 years ago. Although under Helene and Christophoros, the vassals accepted this change of management, they were ready to return to the old days now. Hoping that the Theodosian walls would hold out for some time, the army continued its efforts to put down the Persian rebels. Wisely, Theodosia, the regent of the empire, arranged for an alliance with England by promising Rodanti's hand to an English prince one day, and although such a marriage was far off from now, it would likely be beneficial even outside this war. The English took their longships down the Volga and Don into the Caspian Sea and met with the Roman armies in Dalan, where they defeated the Muslim rebels. All that remained now were their pretenders, but by now they had wreaked quite some havoc on the western half of the country. After occupying all of Azerbaijan's land and putting the rebels on edge with her show of force and English allies, the army was lowered and re-raised to the side of Thrace. The rebels had amassed in Nicaea, holding some cities there, but tensions among them were high. The fear of punishment for their rebellion had crept in, and in that fear there was disunity. Rhodanthi's commanders sent the army to Cybele, hoping to defeat the smaller splinter armies before they could unify. At first it was going well, but as more and more men piled in, the battle seemed to be going in the rebels' favor, and so the commander, on behalf of his liege, signed a truce then and there. The vassals would be free to return to their homes unscathed, and they would also give up their rebellion for the time being. This was by no means at all an end to the conflict, but rather a time for both sides to build up for a real fight. The Queen of Thessalonica, Iona, who rebelled against the crown, was coerced into giving up her throne anyway, on account of her just and humble nature. She had felt guilty for betraying the crown in its time of need, and willingly stepped down from her throne. This was a good opportunity for the Basilissa to gain some power for herself, and implant some loyal vassals in the heart of the empire. She felt confident enough that, though still only a girl, she ordered that the campaigns in Persia continue. This was met with some strange looks, as it was clear that her throne was far from secure, but she demanded that the work of her grandfather be continued. It must have been her aunt influencing her or something, or else why would she be aware of such campaigns? Either way, the army did as it was commanded, and invaded a small emirate between Merv and Dalam, in Nishapur. Afterwards, more campaigns in the frontiers of Persia were ordered, and eventually, Rhodanthi did reveal how she knew of her grandfather's exploits. She had read his chronicle. Due to her previous education, she already was aware of the Achaemenid figures like Darius the Great and Amestris, and after reading that her father was the rightful descendant of the great figure from the past, she felt the need to keep this legacy untarnished and continue it. She may have been living in a bit of a fantasy, as most readers of that chronicle understood that it was something of a metaphorical lineage, not an actual blood lineage, but nonetheless the child's mind was made up. She came of age finally in August of 1159, and her knowledge of literature did indeed measure up to her ability to read the royal chronicles from a young age. She continued to pursue these scholarly avenues into her adulthood, but first she wanted to visit Rome, which had been the subject of many great stories and tales that she could remember. Being exposed to the world after so much time in the palace did leave Rhodanthi ill, but that was part of building up her strength, surely. Upon returning home, the wars resumed, starting with Herat. It seemed Rhodanthi was intent on ruling all of Persia in her grandfather's name. In April of 1168, she became the Empress of Persia, having conquered the majority of the region, and now being the ruler of both the Roman and Persian empires. This moment, reminiscent of Alexander the Great, was actually met with relatively little fanfare. There was no great Persian emperor to throw off the throne. There was no era of wars between the two empires. Instead, the perception around Rhodanthi was that of an opportunist. She picked at the scraps of a dead Seljuk empire. This was a disappointing outcome for the Empress, who instead sent her troops unceremoniously to England to aid her allies there, and then she sat, considering why things hadn't felt grand. Where were the triumphs of great conquest and the stories? The truth was, she had not slain a dragon, but instead put a dead horse out of its misery. By this point in history, the Persian Empire was no longer great. She was stuck in the Achaemenid stories of greatness, not realizing the last great Persian Empire was a Turkish Khanate. We've got the wonderful power of hindsight to inform us of that reality, but for Rhodanthi, she remained in the dark and simply worked on completing her conquest in Persia. It might sound strange, but routine became further glorious conquest in the name of the Greco-Persian heritage of the Antiochites family through Darius. Rather unceremoniously, Rhodanthi continued her conquests, even during a plague in the west, and she caught tuberculosis. Luckily, she'd given birth to a few heirs with which she continued her rule, but a turn of fate, these heirs would, indirectly, result in her death. Just after giving birth at the age of 29, Rhodanthi died from the stress of those births and the ennui of an empire without celebration. Breaking with tradition though, she chose to pass her empire on to her daughter, Athanasia II, with the hopes that this daughter of hers could redeem the sorrowful reign of her drunken mother. Athanasia II is just a couple years old, and with her coronation the realm already felt grim. She coughed a bloody phlegm ball up and began crying during the ceremony, and so it was decided she could be crowned later, after a visit from the physician. It was likely that she'd survive, since the doctors treated her well, and she was a healthy child, but it was still a poor start to the reign of a child. Athanasia's regent was her father, and he didn't trust anyone in the court with all their treacherous looks, and so decided to send the Basilissa off to Aquitaine to be educated by the king there, who he believed would be able to handle the job of raising a proper emperor. King Marceau of Aquitaine was a learned and experienced king with 3 children of his own, who was far enough away that he wouldn't have any reason to harm Athanasia. In secret, the Empress was transported to Bordeaux for her education, and her father handled the realm in her absence. Shortly after, a faction of nobles that supported Makarios of Philippopolis rose up, demanding the throne. This was the vast majority of the empire, and although Athanasia had an alliance with the Queen of Castile through a betrothal, this was certainly looking grim. The loyalist armies took up arms at Constantinople and crossed into Nicaea, hoping to attack the enemy before they could form up, but even half of the rebel army was enough to equal the imperial armies. In the Battle of Prusa, the army was soundly defeated, but they made it to safety in Constantinople. That safety was quickly disrupted when another army from Calliopolis arrived in Briseis to catch out the army. This army was even larger and sent the legions packing. They then set up camp outside of Constantinople, and in the chaos, a few periphery vassals got their independence. After Constantinople fell and the war was over, Athanasia losing her throne in February of 1175. She did still have Persia at least, but it was a foreign land where she had no personal territory. The imperial capital was moved to Rome, and now this would be a Persian empire governed from the Eternal City, which certainly felt a bit strange. Most of the legions had to be disbanded since they were just too expensive to maintain without the income of Constantinople. It was fortunate at least that Athanasia was doing well under her guardian Aquitaine. She was not, as of yet, made aware of what happened back home, but by the time she was a bit older, she might be ready to hear and understand the news. For now, she was enjoying the presence of her new best friend, Helios, who was her only bastion from loneliness in a world full of boring tutors and foreign educators. In her free time, Athanasia would roam the Aquitainian guardians, picking flowers with her imaginary friend. Meanwhile, her armies were being slaughtered in the east. Despite having escaped the treachery of the Byzantine Empire, the Persian Empire posed new problems with similarly difficult to implement solutions. The rebellious Persian and Muslim populations of the region were not very happy being ruled by Greeks. They were already in the process of rebelling beforehand, but were now on their way to winning. They had occupied parts of Khorasan and were now massed in Baluchistan, threatening to reduce the Persian Empire to just its heart around Isfahan. The army, by this point, was tired, underpaid, outnumbered, and demoralized. They tried to fight in Makran, but before the battle could conclude, a treaty was signed and the war ended with a new Persian kingdom in Khorasan and several smaller states in the west forming a buffer between the Byzantines and Persis. Back in Aquitaine, Athanasia was presenting her new poetry to her best friend Helios. You wouldn't think it would end up this way, but through Helios, Athanasia was developing a much more social personality. Although Marceau of Aquitaine was her tutor, he was only teaching her the boring lessons of rulership. Through Helios, she was learning to be a human. She made her first real friend, Svetlana, after having fun playing some games with the other kids in the court, and it turns out that the things that make imaginary friends happy are pretty much the same as real friends. Back in Persia, Athanasia's father and regent worked to fix up the economy. Most of the army was disbanded to make enough cash to keep the court running, but the problem could only be truly solved with the acquisition of a new royal domain. The best way to get some would of course be to conquer it. Sure, the armies were in a weakened state, but this is still the imperial army of the Basilissa in exile, isn't it? The armies went after the recently freed Arabs of Mosul, looking to take it over and turn it into a new breadbasket for the imperial coffers. Using her Spanish allies, Athanasia's armies were able to defeat the Jaziran Arabs, and now the great cities of Mosul and Nineveh would become the new breadbaskets of the realm. It would take time and investment to bring them up to the level of Constantinople, but they'd get there in due time. For the most part, Athanasia's relationship with her imaginary friend Helios had been a positive in her life, but where it started to take a nosedive was when she began to pull the imaginary into reality. While attending some classes, she began speaking to her friend as if he really were there, and although some eccentricity would make for a more talented ruler, it was certainly not a sign of her mental stability in the eyes of the realm. Thankfully, she's sequestered away in Aquitaine for now, although the vassals of Persis were certainly feeling antsy about not seeing their empress in so many years. That eccentricity graduated into full-on lunacy after a series of difficult exams and a refusal to find an outlet for that stress. Kids these days sure do have a huge workload these days, eh? Regardless of Athanasia's degrading mental health, the empire's health was on the rise. The realm's income was ballooning with the new farmland in Jazira, and all those legions that once had been lost could be rehired. While putting down another Muslim rebellion, Makarios, who had dethroned Athanasia just about a decade earlier, declared war to take the island of Sicily, which had remained outside Byzantine control. The Basileus was strong, and rather than waste resources on a losing war for the land that wasn't worth it, the regent and council let it go. In 1186, she grew up, finally achieving an immense level of martial knowledge. Athanasia was an exalted warlord, and she was ready to bring fear and destruction to the enemies of Persia. She returned across the Mediterranean, guided by her father home, and he informed her of the situation about her throne in Constantinople. Ultimately, Athanasia was a forgiving person, and so decided that rather than incite further conflict, she would just focus on building up her new empire in Persia, which thankfully was facilitated by the wise decision-making of the council to make Jazira a new breadbasket. To relieve some of the stress of her rigorous education, she held a feast with the lords. This was more importantly to signal that her majesty was finally, properly taking her throne, and that the vassals were welcome to attend and show their fealty. In addition to that, she found solace in browsing the selection of prisoners in the realm and hearing their stories before promptly forgiving them of whatever crimes they committed. There was something to be said for feeling like a positive force in the world, and at least for these poor prisoners, Athanasia was doing something quite powerful. After feasting and soothing her soul over those forgiven prisoners, she focused herself on the military matters of the realm. Her council explained to her the situation of the Ardashirid kingdom in Khorasan, which was, of course, an entirely untenable threat to the empire's existence. The kingdom was located in the heart of eastern Persia, and while it remained there, it would loom over the empire, a shameful indication of a dying realm. Atanasia could obviously not convince the Shah there to submit willingly, so she declared war with her new legions ready to back her. It was time to make Persia whole. She quickly occupied the capital at Herat. Afterwards, she caught a tiny army in western Afghanistan and defeated them easily. It turns out the Ardashirid kingdom needed much more time to prepare for its great campaign to liberate Persia, but those plans were gone now. The Ardashirid Shah was allowed to keep his title as a vassal of the Persian Empire, and in due time he and his lineage would be assimilated to this new Greco-Persian Empire. From there, Atanasia set her eyes on a very different goal. Being a little bit of an eccentric type, Atanasia decided that rather than reclaim her rights to Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire, she would instead set her sights on her actual birthright, England. The English had been, in the Empire's mind, unacceptably passive in their combat against the rebels when Atanasia was still Basilissa of Byzantium. For that, she decided they'd go down first, before Constantinople would. She's planning for it later though. For now, she's going to consolidate more land in Jazeera under her rule, including the land there under the Byzantine Empire. She's ready to test the waters on confronting the usurper family in Constantinople. It would be a risk to go for the entire empire with the possibility of losing the war and with it her claim on it. Turns out she had overestimated her enemy. The usurpers of Constantinople had wasted their time and money on short-term embezzlement of imperial funds rather than new armies and sources of income. When war came, the empire fell into civil war from petty hawks who thought their time had come, but Atanasia took Byzantine Jazeera and left it at that. By this point, she had, in some ways, become more attached to this half of her empire than the more prestigious western half. She renamed the empire officially to Persis in reference to its proper Greek name, and put the capital in Isfahan instead of Rome. With her arrival in Isfahan, she began a legend about her new legions. There were no longer Roman legions, but instead the reinstated form of Herodotus' account of the immortals of Persia. Although Atanasia was Greek, she found great inspiration in the Achaemenid stories she had been diving into, and had proven her worth as an empress enough to motivate and discipline the troops. Her talents as a strategist inspired each and every soldier to die for their empire, just like the immortals of yore would have. The legend would need its time to cook, and in that time, Atanasia toured the realm, feasted, hunted, and generally accustomed her subjects to her rule, which she considered to be benevolent. Indeed it was, as she was a kind, social, and forgiving empress that committed no tyranny. She held a grand tournament in Isfahan where she won the recital and board game competitions, but was bested in horsemanship. Nonetheless, the vassals who chose to remain loyal to her felt it had been the right choice, and it was clear that the way of life and culture around Isfahan, while so definitely Greek, was shifting. It was quite a shock to the Greek people at first to see such a powerful woman leading her troops to victory, but as Atanasia proved her prowess, she was able to show that women deserved a place in the army. This new Greek culture, called Persoi, was an egalitarian culture with an emphasis on both meritocracy and cultural acceptance. Obviously, being in a foreign land, it was easier to learn from and understand the locals than to try and crush them. In the past, the Persians had risen up against their Greek conquerors in fear of what they'd do to them, but instead, through her vassalization of the Ardashirid kingdom, she showed that they could live longer without hatred. The kings in northeastern Persia had been allowed to keep their place, and with that, the Persoi identity was guaranteed. Shortly after, the immortal legend was complete, and with it came droves of men and women looking to provide their service to the great Greco-Persian Empire. At almost no cost whatsoever, Atanasia recruited, equipped, and commanded a unit of revived Greek immortals. While they were immensely expensive compared to the other more common heavy infantry units, they were hugely durable and able to defeat cavalry and other spearmen with ease. They would be a great addition to the Persian army, and in good time, they'll reclaim the rest of Greece for the Persoi. Afterwards, she visited her knights' barracks to check in on them, and all of them were greatly motivated by their great empress's presence. Their abilities were amplified simply by her presence, and with enough practice, they'd be ready to destroy any enemy. To prove the superiority of the new Persis over the old Greece, Atanasia declared a ceremonial war against Anna of the Byzantine Empire, which is a war for neither territory nor loot, but just glory. The victor would see their acclaimed knights gain glory, and their regular knights get invaluable practice and glory. The Byzantines were so cowardly they let Cilicia and much of Anatolia fall without any resistance, before Atanasia sent her troops in boats up to Constantinople to confront the enemy forces directly. Turns out the gross mismanagement of the empire in the hands of Anna had left it in disrepair. There was unending civil war and burning fortresses along the coast. Constantinople did remain untouched thanks to its walls, but the many mangonels of Persia would take them down. The war was over, and the Greeks were humiliated by their cousins in Isfahan. Lessons from the siege of Constantinople taught the Perso-Greeks about the creation of trebuchets, which if it should ever need to happen, could be used to demolish any ancient Greek wall on a whim. By this point, it was time to claim England of all places. This was a strange choice of conquest, but it was true that Athanasia's father was an English prince, and so his claims did pass on to her. There was no reason not to claim her birthright in a way. Glory is glory, and so the Persian legions sailed out of the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic to arrive in Canterbury. The trebuchets were so immensely efficient that every single castle in southeastern England fell before the English troops could even arrive. Once they did arrive, the immortals wiped the floor with them, and England, along with its holdings in France, was conquered. She gave the kingdom to her son Romanos, since she intended to give the empire to one of her daughters. She didn't want her son feeling scorned, so secured him land somewhere at least, even if it was comparably a backwater. It was indeed such a backwater that just a few years later, Romanos chose to step down and allow the vassals there to put the old king back on the throne. While certainly disappointing, it was, in a way, the boy's choice if he wanted to rule. Athanasia made it clear to Romanos that if he complained about being left out of the inheritance, he'd have only himself to blame for it. He understood, but curiously chose to stay in his domain in Essex as a vassal of Britannia. Why he would do that was beyond the Empress's unending wisdom, but she figured it was some kind of childlike rebellion and left him to his fate. There was a bigger issue now. Namely, the rather prompt rise of the Mongol Empire in the east, which was now barreling down the steppes directly into the borderlands of Persia. Athanasia was so focused on her western orientation that she had ignored all the messengers from the east. She would have been wise to prepare for the coming of the Mongols. Temujin, known as the Child Killer, was, as expected, not a pleasant man. He was the Khan of Khans, looking to conquer the entire world for his people. His nobility was weak, but his power incomparable. That being said, the Mongols were not used to such a martially capable culture as the one cultivated in Persia under Athanasia. Their soldiers were hardened from wars locally and overseas alike. They were disciplined and motivated, and were backed by the glorious legends of the past. More than that even, they were backed by massive trebuchets that could make short work of the border fortresses in Turan. The Mongols moved fast, and were in East Tokaristan almost instantly, but in that time, the Persian legion had already occupied Nakshab, and was ready to head east. Led by Athanasia herself, the soldiers were confident in their ability to defeat the terrifying Mongols. In the past, horse archers had been a menace on settled society, but the advent of the crossbow gave Persian archers a powerful weapon to kill the horses from under the archers from a safe distance. The armies met East Tokaristan, and every nearby Mongol army rerouted to support them, not expecting a head-on attack. The battle was bloody but decisive all the same. The Persians won, inflicting what was likely the first defeat on the Mongol armies. While they retreated, the Persian legions occupied more towns along the border, laying waste to the walls but sparing the people, hoping to embolden resistance to the Mongols as they went. After another decisive battle and a siege in Rusht, the Mongols surrendered. Temujin was shamed, but he was a determined man. It was with no doubt that he would continue his work in other directions, but it was also with no doubt that he knew these Persians were to be respected as adversaries. Anna of Byzantium was by this point an old woman who likely wouldn't be able to fend off the Mongols. Although Athanasia was comfortable with the world where she ruled in Persia and the pretenders squatted in Constantinople, she was not okay with the Mongols destroying Greece, which they surely would if they set their eyes on it. Once it became clear that the Mongols were coming for Byzantium, Athanasia would invade, but for now, she was biding her time. She declared another ceremonial war, looking to train up her troops for further conflict against the Mongols. The war was simple, and Athanasia's troops were better drilled than ever. Heading into her 40s, Athanasia is ruling over a prosperous realm which maintains the balance of power between the Mongols and the Byzantines. The moment the Mongols make their move against Greece, she'll step in to take it over before they can, and then it'll just be the Mongols against the Perso-Greeks. The Mongols made another attempt to take Persia, and this one was a little better since the armies were off in the Horn of Africa working to take back a piece of Azerbaijan that was inherited out of the realm. What the Mongols lacked in ability to fight, they made up for in opportunism, as they quickly descended upon eastern Persia. They very nearly won the war before the legions could make it to confront them, but they did get there in the nick of time. After pushing them back out and occupying fortresses on the border, peace was signed, and the Mongols paid back the loot they took. From there, the realm enjoyed peace, while Athanasia attended a funeral for the Ecumenical Patriarch of Orthodoxy, who was her personal friend before her death. In the name of her friend, the Patriarch of Orthodox Christianity, she embarked on a campaign to bring Jerusalem back into the Christian world. The Catholics and their crusades had failed so far, which, to be fair to them, may have been because the Pope lost his seat in Rome, but regardless, Athanasia took it on herself to get the Holy Land back. The Muslim world is highly fractured in the face of losing Baghdad and Syria, so the Holy Land was controlled directly by the Shia Caliphate, which was far too weak to resist, and the other Muslims in the area were too divided to bother helping. She gave one of her sons Jerusalem and Tiberias, and then conquered Alexandria as another holy site for her faith. Immediately following that, she heard news of the Mongol invasion of the Byzantines, and with that, it was time to bring the West back into the fold. If the Mongols were to secure Greece and Anatolia, they'd gain immense power, and they'd pillage and ravage the region. That cannot stand. Basilius Theodoros, a literal dwarf but nonetheless skilled ruler, just isn't equipped to fight the Mongols. The Persian army was raised and sent in boats to Constantinople. The Mongols had no such navy, so they wouldn't be able to sail right up to the great city, which gave Athanasia the advantage. The trebuchets and their operators made the Theodosian walls into dust, and then the army occupied much of Thrace and Bulgaria. The dwarf Basilius was captured there in battle, and the war ended in just 8 months. The Mongols had been thwarted, but they kept the war up. The army first was disbanded to let them regroup before attacking the Mongols in Armenia. They had made several occupations there, but it wouldn't mean anything with how quickly occupations could be undone by the imperial army. With this, the empires have been united and secured, but the administrative costs of holding the Byzantine Empire almost felt not worth it in a way. Persia had, by this point, become the focal point of the Antiochutes dynasty, a testament to their adaptability and power. Even after being removed from the throne, this lineage simply made a better home in a new land. With this new land also came further integration into the pre-existing cultures and faiths there. The Persoi were definitely still Greek, but their time around the Iranians had its little influences. There was an influx of vocabulary and mannerisms, but more importantly, there was a revival of some Zoroastrian practices after the Gnostic Bogomils in southeastern Persia had come to power there. The Bogomils, as pacifists, were mostly tolerated in Persia, but their Gnosticism made them much more accepting of many Eastern faiths compared to the more Orthodox Church. With all the holy sites of Eastern Christendom secured, Athanasia was looking for a new faith to bring to her people, if only because the Orthodox Church was permanently tied to Constantinople. The new imperial capital was Isfahan, but the idea of a Christian empire run from a city east of Mesopotamia didn't seem viable. Combining Christian traditions and missionary work with the priorities and cultural values of the Persian Zoroastrians, Athanasia created the Ecclesia tis Photias, Greek for the Church of Fire, which was an Eastern syncretized form of Christianity with unrestricted marriage and revered witchcraft. While this change might seem out of nowhere, in reality it was a process which had been ongoing in the background. The exchange of cultural and religious values that happens in bustling cities like Isfahan, Mosul, and Hamadan naturally led to this outcome. With all the holy sites controlled, though, Athanasia was able to mend the schism, and this is where the plausibility of the scenario kinda falls apart. Most of the Christian world would convert to the Fire Church, and with that, Persia, as the center of the world, became a hub of Christian and Western thought. With that conversion came, as well, another war from the Mongols, but they were demanding a curious tract of land. Rather than invade the heartlands of the empire, they wanted the outskirts in the steppes, which in many ways was an acceptable land transfer for Athanasia. Rather than fight over crappy land, the Mongols were given that land in the hopes of creating an acceptable borderland that everyone could live with. Out of character here, I did this because it made the borders look really nice. Isn't that beautiful? After completing a legitimizing legend based around her holy blood, Athanasia used its rewards to integrate Armenia into Persia rather than Byzantium, ending a millennia-long struggle for that land between Greeks and Persians. Whether she ended it in favor of the Persians or Greeks, though, was uncertain since she was Greco-Persian, so in reality maybe it wasn't an ended conflict. More time passed where Athanasia finally began to sit on her laurels. She was done fighting and conquering. It was with the news that she would be entering a form of retirement that the Mongols went much harder with their invasions west. They conquered the Holy Roman Empire, Hungary, and even Carpathia, which Athanasia just let them have. Why fight for these random borderlands? Who cares about them anymore? Also, it makes the borders look nice. Stepping out of character a little bit here as well, I briefly converted to Mazdeazna just so I could become the Salechiant, since I had the roleplay in my head that this new Christian church was Zoroastrian syncretized, but I couldn't use that to become the Salechiant. Maybe it's something which I could have justified, but I couldn't think of anything good. For gameplay reasons, I became Zoroastrian for a day, became the Salechiant, then converted back. As the Salechiant, a legend connecting Athanasia to the ancient prophet Zoroaster came about, and although she's quite old at 73 now, she might just live long enough to see its completion. In light of her immense figure, the broken up states of Italy swore fealty to the Persian Empire, and the Pope just outside of Latium was also conquered. Although Athanasia had effectively retired from her life as a conqueror, wiping out these little border heretics wasn't an interruption to her peaceful retirement. In order to permanently eradicate the papacy, she'd have to completely control Italia. Fortunately, before she could finish her work, she caught smallpox and did not survive. Athanasia, the greatest empress of Byzantium and Persia, who was unlawfully exiled and raised in Aquitaine, finally passed her empire on to her daughter, Athanasia III. It was only natural that her heir would share her name. Engaging in the Zoroastrian tradition that her church integrated, Athanasia III betrothed herself to her brother, and with that, the tone of her reign was established. The Mongols had reached as far as Spain, but had not broken past the Caucasus thanks to Persis. Nonetheless, the subject of the realm did not express their gratitude, instead starting a war for more rights. The absolute authority of the previous Atanasia had not been earned by this new one, and so they rose up. At the same time, an independence movement began, and the empire looked to be in dire straits, but thankfully, the Perso-Greek legions were in a powerful enough position that they could likely match all these enemies in the field. The Liberty faction ended hostilities when they lost several key battles, and then Atanasia III promised amnesty for them if they stopped the war right away. Without that distraction, the independence movement wasn't able to put up a strong enough fight on their own to win, so Trebizond was occupied and the rebels put into prison. With the realm secure, Atanasia III assured her throne with those rebels defeated, and so moved on to other projects in Italia. The Mongols had a small section of Friuli, and the Sardinians still had their own kingdom, which needed to be either conquered or vassalized. After a quick conquest in Tunis to secure the waters there, she declared war on the Mongols to take their holdings in Italy. This war would end up being quite long because the Mongols were insistent that the Greek armies had not occupied their war targets, when actually they had. This is because of a bug that's been in the game since the beginning, where the take all the Jiri land CB doesn't have a proper war goal. During the war, the legend Atanasia II had started about her connection to Zoroaster reached its peak, and Atanasia III was proclaimed one of the sons of Zoroaster. This was strange, since she was a woman, but Zoroaster, as a male, passed his spirit, gender and all, into his reincarnation on Earth, meaning despite being outwardly a woman, Atanasia's soul was that of a man. Or I guess I could just change the localization to say child of Zoroaster, but you know, what sounds cooler. Thanks to that legend, she was considered pure-blooded, and both she and her children benefited from a truly legendary bloodline of Achaemenid grandeur and Zoroastrian divinity. While all this war was going on, men and women dying in battle and poor peasants caught in the crossfire, there was yet more unspeakable death happening in the east. The Black Death had made its way west from Asia and was ravaging the entire country. There had been plagues across time in Persia and Greece, but nothing on this level. The war with the Mongols ended, but another one broke out right after, with the Mongols thinking the plague would leave the empire vulnerable. They were going for an invasion of Persis, and while it was true that the plague was harming the army's ability to fight and organize, they also knew that this was not just a border scuffle, but a proper defense of the nation. Several of the realm's minorities rose up in rebellion during the plagues, hoping to get their independence by attacking while the plague of the Mongols and the plague of the Black Death ravaged the realm, but they underestimated the abilities of the army to fight off both. The Mongols were pushed out of Persia in 1258, and shortly after, the Muslim rebels in Arabia and the Christian heretics of Italia were put down, leaving the realm in a peace, as it also recovered from the plague, which was finally disappearing from the land. Although it was expensive, Atanasia III put in all her money, and even money she didn't have, into rebuilding efforts after the plague, and immediately got her steward to rebuild the lost grandeur of Constantinople, which she had made the administrative capital to center the realm's business more. Isfahan was still the ceremonial capital. There was a reason Constantinople had always been a Byzantine capital, and it was because of its central position. In peace and the end of the Black Death, the realm saw great growth and prosperity. Although the Black Death had destroyed much of society, it left those who remained with more power within that society. Atanasia took a grand tour to survey the damage and found that the still living peasants had much better lives now, with higher wages and more appreciation for life. They were the ones spared, and therefore didn't have much to complain about anymore. Rather hilariously, the Catholics, what remained of them, declared a crusade for Rome, with the Pope urging every remaining Catholic to fight, and this news just made Atanasia laugh. There were only a handful of Catholics left in the world, and they were willing to put to the sword even other Christians to try and hold on to their power. Fine, she said, we'll put them to the sword first. While the crusade whimpered its way to Romania, the great Khans of Mongolia finally had an end to their lineage of greatness, with all the most competent Khans having been killed or dying to alcohol poisoning. The menace of the world was fractured into several smaller Khanates. The Toxol Khanate of Western Europe, the White Horde of Central Europe, the Golden Horde of the Steppes and Eastern Europe, the Chagatai Khanate of the Tarim Basin, and of course, Mongolia. Western Europe was ruled by a Muslim Mongol, the White Horde by a Christian, and the Golden Horde, Chagatai Khanate, and Mongolia were also Muslim ruled. Thankfully for the local inhabitants, it was Maturidi Islam, which was quite tolerant, and hopefully the Mongols will keep the peace in their respective parts of the world. The Crusaders were defeated in 1269, and with that, the legend about Cyrus, the last Achaemenid legend, began. It was ironic that although Cyrus was the first Shahanshah, he would be the last of the great figures of old that the Antiochutes family would claim a connection to. Looking to ensure that no crusade ever came about again, Atanasia set out to dismantle the papacy, but she needed the loyalty of the Sardinians for that. They were getting along quite well, and in the spirit of the Cyrus legend, she chose to try and peacefully accept and vassalize the Sardinians. Cyrus was famously tolerant in his empire, letting his subjects live as they liked, and so to represent that, Queen Barbara of Sardinia-Corsica was encouraged to join the empire without threat of conquest. It was truly her own choice. During a feast in Rome, Barbara was honored as a guest of the Perso-Greek Empire, and in seeing the great grandeur of the realm demonstrated in that feast, Barbara was convinced and did join the empire, securing control over all of Italia. The papacy was dissolved and the Pope invited to come live in Greece among the real Christians of this world. Afterwards, with the former Pope bowing before the Empress of Persia, Greece, and Italy, a new empire was declared. In the spirit of the Roman Empire, Atanasia called herself Caesar, but she chose a different name for the empire. This was the Achaemenid Empire, and all its glory restored. She was the first Shahanshah of the Neo-Achaemenid Empire, and her legend, spread far and wide, confirmed her lineage from Cyrus. As a descendant of the legendary Cyrus, all her vassals, in pure awe, committed to complete and utter loyalty, and Atanasia's power as an administrator massively increased. She had perfect loyalty and perfect control over this revived Achaemenid Empire, which, although missing some parts of the old empire, had replaced them with far more valuable new ones. Her final conquest would be in Egypt, since it was a critical province of both the Roman and Achaemenid empires of old. Egypt was ruled by some Nubians who had filled in the Muslim power vacuum there. She invaded, winning without any hassle, and although she could have continued on to take what remained of Syria and Arabia that was outside of her control, she instead completed a legend declaring herself the new Caesar and added Egypt to the de jure borders of the Achaemenid Empire before ruling for the rest of her life in true peace. In a combination of Latin and Persian, this era would be known as the Pax Haxamanis, Latin for peace and Old Persian for Achaemenid. The empire was full of utterly loyal vassals, and there was no more enemies to fight. The Mongols were gone, and their successor states composed of loose affiliations and distrust. The Neo-Achaemenid Empire was here to stay for far longer than any other Iranian empire of old. This is the end of the video here, and I've now showcased every single legend in my mod. I'll be releasing a patch for it in the next week or so, which will add more random events, more artifacts, and even a new legend alongside some localization fixes and maybe some balance changes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider subscribing, liking, and of course, checking out the Achaemenid Legends mod in the description below. I worked very hard on this mod and still am working on it, so it would mean the world for me for you to go and check it out. Thank you for your time.